The longer issue I have is that I had sent to all of you the investigation report for Mason Classical Academy that I have been working on for quite some time. Certainly the investigation itself has gone back since last summer. So I will try not to spend too much time, but I think it's important that I lay out the issues that are contained in that report so that we are clear as to what we are doing. On or about June the 7th, 2018, Joseph Baird, who was a former Mason Classical Academy board member, treasurer, and a parent of many students who had previously been enrolled there, had filed a detailed complaint. And if you've seen it, it's probably 12 pages in length. And he filed it with the Florida Department of Education's Office of the Inspector General. And he alleged a whole series of wrongdoing involving MCA board members, especially Ms. Lichter and Ms. Miller, and the school's principal, Mr. Hull. His allegations were of particular concern because they indicated that there may have been wrongdoing in the area of finance. There was a concern of not following proper protocol. There was a concern of the governance model was not being followed, and agenda items were not being followed, and one could go on and on. On June the 13th, the Office of the Inspector General acknowledged the receipt of the complaint, but based upon his review of statutory law, Constitution, and so on, he made the determination that a complaint such as that of Mr. Baird was more appropriately to be reviewed and undertaken at the local level. And certainly there are constitutional provisions that then would kick in which the district school board would be the party that would oversee it. And he said just that to Mr. Baird, and he sent it to Mr. Terry, but he also sent it as well to the Department of Education's Charter School Division. So he then said, in essence, you need to determine whether you want to move forward. And what we were finding was not only the gravity of the complaint, but increasingly we were finding that many parents that were contacting the district had complained that many of their issues were not being addressed, that their grievances were not being attended to, and so on. And we know that this has been ongoing. Board members have received this stuff for some time. The district had taken a kind of laissez-faire, hands-off approach for a while, believing that when we received those, often my instruction to charter school directors was bring it back to the school, let's give them the opportunity to look into it, and let their board try to handle it. But we were finding increasingly that the complaints were nothing was being done. So we began to look into this matter. And in August, we started to get a lot of people coming forward, both former faculty members and parents. Many of these folks were concerned and fearful that there could be reprisals or whatever. They expressed that concern, not only to me, I must say, but I began to speak with our staff members that over the course of the year and so on, that people within our guidance programs and other agencies where they would call in for assistance would indicate that they were worried about complaining too loudly, so to speak. So more and more people were coming in, and Mr. Hull became aware that people were coming in. And I mention that because you noticed that last month one of the issues was we weren't aware of any investigation. Well, he was. Why would he have written to Cheryl Rogers in September asking about why so many people are coming forward to complain if he wasn't aware that we were looking into it? Of course he was. And then he wrote, I think quite tellingly, and I will read it to you, a statement of, for me, I experienced it as rather arrogant, sadly. He's a bright man. And he wrote to Dr. Rogers as follows: "We take complaints seriously because that is a great way to self-reflect and become a stronger institution for students and their families. However, there's been only one official complaint in over 4 years of operation. This could be very well the result of CCPS interference, or MCA is just that good at pleasing our parent base. There are other issues along these same lines that do not paint the CCPS governance in a good light, but I'll refrain from pointing those issues out." Now, why would you say things like that if, in fact, you did not have some worry in mind? And to say that MCA is just that good at pleasing our parent base, she flies in the face of the information we receive from our own internal tracking and reporting, in which we're able to track those that leave Mason, for example, or any charter school, and re-enroll here, re-enroll or go into homeschooling or private schooling. And what did we find? Since 2014, 614 students had left. That's a lot of people. So when you say we're just that good at pleasing a parent base, I think you're overlooking something very basic. With that in mind, we undertook a careful review. We listened to a lot of people, and those people included parents, faculty members. They included persons who we work with internally on different staffs. For example, I learned things about complaints about ESE programs, complaints concerning gifted evaluations. We learned things about how they were handling student reporting and that sort of thing that left us ever more concerned. So at the end of the day, when I was thinking of a methodology, so to speak, of how to understand and piece this together, one, we look for commonalities of experience and expression that people articulated, but we had a huge amount of not only emails, but I reviewed the entire record of minutes from 2014 to the present, along with all policies and procedures and other documents that are Mason as part of it. And the rule of thumb I took was, well, let's let the documents speak for themselves. Okay, if you're worried about hearsay and that sort of thing, well, what you write is what you write. And they became, in and of themselves, very telling. The springboard for all of this was the complaint of Mr. Baird, an extensive complaint that I will go over with you, that he broke out into several sections. I, in my report, broke them out into several categories. For example, part of his concern was the handling of a financial oversight committee, and he broke it into two core issues. For example, its formation and membership, and the inability to properly undertake his role as a treasurer. In that regard, a little bit of history there. Mason had ongoing finance committee that typically met monthly. It was very serious about what it did. And then there was a decision made in 2016 to dissolve it for some reason and replace it with what people were calling a financial oversight committee. So as this moved forward into September of 2016, what people were finding was that there was an interest in discussing that, having such a committee, and secondly, membership on such a committee. Well, Mr. Baird was tasked with encouraging people to serve as members, and then the decision was made that they would move forward with a committee and take these issues up in October, at their October board meeting. The only problem was you had multiple applications of membership. Many of them, in fact, all of them were parents. And the decision was made at that board meeting, we're not going to proceed any further because we need to widen the membership beyond parents. And while they voted on a committee for an oversight committee to kind of create it, so to speak, it never went forward. It was never staffed. It was never followed up with members. It was never any outreach that would allow people to come forward. So what began as a finance committee ultimately collapsed, and there's been no finance committee since 2016, no finance oversight committee. Why this becomes important is if you look at the application of 2013 to become a charter school, it's an extensive document, and it is incorporated by reference into our charter. In there are multiple standing committees that are required: a finance committee, student advisory council committee, an audit committee, and so on. Well, at the end of 2016, out of nowhere, they decided they were going to create an audit committee that was going to be staffed by their compliance officer and 2 board members. They didn't follow the membership criteria, nor did they include anybody that would staff it that was in the community as is required. It became a shell as well. It never went forward. The same thing happened for Student Advisory Committee. For a while you had a PTA, PTO, and so on. And then what I found, and I'm kind of going into other sections so that we can, because thematically it'll be clear, is that in their policies and procedures, there was supposed to have been an employment committee. That employment committee, which was like a standing committee, was supposed to advise all board members, for example, as to data received concerning staff salaries, including the principals. That never happened. So you now see all these committees that should have occurred not occurring. And so it became almost a rubber stamping in terms of accepting contracts, looking at staffing reports, salaries, and so on, without the review that was supposed to be required on the basis of application and policy. So the concerns that Mr. Baird have, to my mind, were well-founded. And I say that because one of the key people who was the consultant for Hillsdale College, and Hillsdale College, as you know, is that college that has provided the curriculum and instructional model, which has made the school academically a strong school. He made very clear to everybody, and board members in 2016 agreed, there should be a finance committee. You need one for the well-being and oversight of the school. Well, nobody paid attention to him. And unfortunately, it just fell apart. Some of the issues that became of concern for Mr. Baird had to do with his ability to carry on as a treasurer. And he started to ask for reports, for example, from the business manager. And Mr. Hull decided that this was going to be too taxing for his employee, and he sent a note to Ms. Lichter. Ms. Lichter, in turn, wrote to Mr. Baird, her fellow board member, and essentially said, back off, this is too time-consuming. It's best that we take care of this at the Finance Oversight Committee, which, of course, we find never occurred, and you need to back away from it. Well, I think it's quite astonishing that a board chair would tell another board member how to conduct their duty as a treasurer and back off. But even more important is that she wrote the letter to another board member, thereby creating a Sunshine Law violation. There was no disclosure in the Sunshine that this thing had occurred, and I think that was very serious. Now, there was precedent. If you look back in the minutes, a gentleman named Jason Lane had come forward. He was a board member and said quite openly, I may have violated the Sunshine Law by not disclosing this particular communication. He went ahead, and you can see it in the board minutes, in which he then said that this occurred. Well, there's ample case law that if you come forward, one case from the 70s from the Supreme Court says you make it all sunshine bright. What was disclosed, what was hidden is now disclosed. And that becomes extremely important. Well, there was no disclosure there. And in time, there was sort of a rancorous meeting on October the 4th, 16. Mr. Baird resigned shortly thereafter. and another gentleman, Mr. Longenecker, became the treasurer, and based upon my findings, over at least a 2-year period, 2.5-year period, there was 2 treasurer's reports that were filed. Everything else, there's no treasurer's reports, which once again shows that absent some sort of financial oversight committee and so on, there is a weakness in the presentation of the finances. So the other area that he brought out that I found was very, very important had to do with governance and oversight and looking into board agendas and so on. Now, one of the things that's very troubling, because it is a public school, is the fact that there are no links to the agenda for the public to pull up any documents. In fact, there's no documents attached to the agendas or to the minutes. Rather, these seem to be put into a Google Drive in which only board members can gain access to it. So I don't know how the public could weigh in on stuff that is not there. One of the things I think I found troubling, maybe a bit amusing, is how do you pass a consent agenda for a public that has no idea what's being consented to? I mean, you have an immediate difficulty there that is of public importance. And one of the email chains showed that the then compliance officer, I believe, said it's just going to be too costly and too burdensome to put them on the agenda. So how does anybody retrieve these sorts of things? And this issue becomes very problematic in the area of policies. Part of the policy formulation at Mason, as it does here, and you can see it in the policies related to policies, is there should be 2 readings, first and a second read. If you look at the minutes and you look at the agendas, one, if you can't gain access to reading anything, how do you know what's going through for your policies? You don't. But more importantly, what I saw was that second readings, and you know what we go through here, second readings, in terms of we try to have a hearing on it, we let people come forward and speak about it, and the board chair typically will then close the hearing. But even if we assume that in the world of a charter school doesn't need to be that formalistic, nevertheless, a second reading means just that publicly. But a great deal of these policies were being sent through in a second reading through consent. So it's awfully hard when you put down an agenda that this just goes into consent and you don't know what they are, that it goes right through and only those who either created it or board members with whom they discussed them would know what they are. I find that of serious concern, in addition to the fact that what I find of serious concern is that there's often disorder in the minutes. You'll find many meetings, for example, in which the wrong dates are on there, the wrong times are on there. You will find, for example, minutes of a meeting that will say started at such and such a time, and then you go to another set of meetings with the identical date that tells you that it actually started 3 hours before. So you don't know, in some instances, what meetings you're really talking about. No one has paid attention to bringing in order and bringing in line those discrepancies, which certainly does not help the public who wants to understand, if they do, what is going on. So those areas became a source of concern. Another area that was a source of concern in all of this, and it was implied in some of the statements of Mr. Baird, was the fact that at least 4 meetings that I could find went forward without a quorum. For me, that's serious business because it's against the law. The Attorney General opinions are clear on that. I understand that within the charter statute there's language that indicates that people can appear by means of electronic communication. But the telling point of all of that is, as you know, there needs to be a quorum physically present. And when you read Mason's own policies, there is a section called proxy voting. And it indicates that those that appear electronically may not count toward the counting of a quorum. So if you have 3 people one is present, and two are there electronically, how do you have a quorum? Nevertheless, you have on the minutes of the meeting saying quorum was present, which of course to any reader would be misleading. That is a particular concern in one instance where I believe it was July of 2018, June of 2018, on a Saturday they held their budgetary meeting. There was no quorum. The meeting lasted 9 minutes long, and that was it. People weren't present for it. There was no quorum. There may have been one person present, the other by electronic means. Now, somebody got wind of that might being a problem, and then when you look at the minutes of November of 2018, something interesting happens. Somebody makes a motion to ratify the budget of June. Why would you do that if you weren't aware of a problem? But nobody comes forward and says, Houston, we had a problem. It's time for us to acknowledge it and clean it up. So the irony of it all is you have the ratification of at one meeting ratifying an illegal act from a previous one. So what have you ratified? You've ratified the illegality, which itself creates a difficulty. And sadly, in December, they voted in, without a quorum, another board member. Well, if you don't have a quorum, then you really don't have a board member. And so what we are left with, and if I'm correct, is that over many months, for example, you would have only 2 board members conducting business, yet our charter says there has to be a minimum of 3, which for me is a material breach in that area. One could go on these issues, but in the interest of time, I will move on to concerns with grievances, parents' concern, and so on. There are some very serious issues in the way parents were treated, and I laid some of those out in the area of grievances. One person, as you recall, years ago, complained about her child being dismissed because they felt there was a feeling that the child was not properly toilet trained as a kindergartner. Well, this particular parent went through every single procedure properly and was not afforded under policy the opportunity of a meeting. She wrote to Mr. Whitehead of her concerns after the child was dismissed. He promised to bring things forward. There's no evidence that anybody reacted to it. She brought forward a formal grievance. So Mr. Hull's statement, there's only been one, is right now wrong. There's been more than that. And no one ever replied to her. She came to us. We didn't reply to her because we were saying you need to deal with the school. And so when this issue, along as you remember the underwear issue that probably was out there, which tragically some poor child went in his pants and flushed it down the toilet, clogging it, they had to have an investigation to see who it was. In essence, who's the culprit without the underwear? Which, of course, for a second-grade child is awfully humiliating. Parents were outraged by it. We don't have to go through all of that. But the point of it all is that people then decided that maybe the press needs to know about it. So this particular parent did speak with the press, and the storm of protest is the which nothing I've ever seen before. Mr. Whitehead, in one of his social media comments, was, for people such as this, I'd have no problem taking out their lease on life. Of course, the parent was terrified when she saw something like that. One could go on, and tragically, the board member Miller, said, I agree with you, Joe. Now, to have this sort of lack of professionalism, to have this sort of recognition this doesn't comply with policy, and the intimidation factors that I could go on and on, I've laid out in this report, is very disconcerting. Adding to the disconcerting element, this particular parent, for whatever reason, Mrs. Lichter at that time said to a pro-charter parent who has made a comment on social media, why don't all of you write to this parent, Mrs. Parker, we can speak openly about it, and tell her how you feel. Well, you're a parent with kids in the school, and now there's this kind of rabble-rousing by your board president. But that was not enough. 3.5 years later, as all of you experienced, she sent this blistering email in which she accused this very parent of having a political connection to Ms. Lucarelli, calling it criminal. Now, you can't do that sort of thing. It's not only inherently defamatory, but if you're serious about classical values, which is part of the problem, such as integrity and virtue and that sort of thing, and you believe in American values, which means freedom of speech, and you're telling somebody, I'll tell you who you should associate with and who you vote for, and I'm the head of a charter school, to use an old expression, Houston, you have a problem. And I think there are many, many instances of this. Tragedy, too, with respect to the principal, and I'll just give you a few examples of it, was the complete disregard of FERPA. You have instances, for example, in which he decided that he did not like the fact that a senior was given the Student of Virtue Award and felt it should be his son, so he intervenes. Now, here's your faculty who's made the choice, and your own principal is emailing you, telling you what you should have done, but in the process sets up a post that lists out all of the demerits and grade point average of the student who received the award and compares it against his son as to who is better. Did he ever contact the parent? No, did not. We see numerous examples of emails to board members here raising parents' names and grades and retention and things of that sort. And then most astonishing, lecturing the board how they should handle things when a parent should bring things to them and not to him first. I have other examples, for example, examples of students' grades and disciplinary records being sent to Dr. Rogers. Under FERPA, as you know, even though she may be the district's director of charter schools, she's not within the zone of interest of persons that should know about somebody's academic background at another school. And so by sending all this information, there's a serious violation of FERPA. Other examples that I found were when parents were asking to see videos based upon discipline. It was confused with a public records request, and the parent was told, you have to pay $294 before we'll let you have any access to this video, rather than realizing what FERPA says is no. If that parent comes into the school, you can show it to them. If they decide they can't make it to the school or they don't want to come into the school, then you can offer charges. But that was never explained, and the parent never was able to view the tapes based upon the infractions. So we have other issues, conflicts of interest issues, such as the creation of a management company that goes out to multiple districts in the state to oversee, give consulting advice to different charter schools that they want to support, that is going to be high-performing like Mason. And these include initially Ms. Lichter, her principal, and Gina Smith, the curriculum coordinator. Ms. Lichter later stepped away and substituted herself with her husband. But what we find initially is the fact that when evaluations are done, in essence, we have a board chair giving a positive evaluation of her own partner when she should have recused herself or disclosed the fact that this is going on. Salary schedules, same thing. Ms. Smith would be part of that salary schedule, so why wouldn't you alert the world that she's one of many and you have to recuse yourself on the salary schedule because it's your partner? But part of the issue, too, unfortunately, is the lack of disclosure in these applications, and I've read them all from these different districts, is that the very school, Hillsdale College, that provided the instructional model for the school's success is never mentioned in any of these, when in fact, in the actual policy binder, there's a whole section that has to be acknowledged that Hillsdale College provides the curricular support, curricular structure, training, and so on. And yet, you knowingly exclude that from your consultancy. I think that's a problem. So at the end of the day, I provided to you extensive recommendations and conclusions. I don't need to go into all of them. Suffice it to say that the actions of the board members warrant very serious review. Same with the principal, same with the vice principal. I personally think the two board members, because of all the commentaries that were out there, need to seriously think of resigning so that we can see a school reconfigure its board into 5 people instead of the same 3. And by the way, I don't see, as we have here, a pattern of organizational meetings, even though that's in their policy binder. So these are serious matters, folks. I can't say it's been a pleasant experience, but those are my findings, and I wanted to share them with you. So I think I've spoken long enough. I'm probably hearing people in the audience saying, "Yep, we agree you've spoken too much, thank God." So I'm stopping right now.
Okay, I'm going to allow board members to just make a comment.
Thank you, by the way, for your patience, Mr.
Make
Terry,
a comment if they want to. I'm going to start with Dr. Westbury. Okay. If you don't want to make a comment, that's fine.
Come back to me. I'm processing.
Mr. Carter.
Mr. Fishbane, thank you for working so diligently on this. I know there were several hours put into this, and your staff as well. As you read through these things, it makes me appreciate you even more on how you make sure we're always doing the right thing legally, along with Dr. Patton and everybody here present, Mr. Spencer and everybody. We appreciate your hard work. You know, it is alarming to see these things. On page 56, you said lack of supporting documents for school year 17 and 18 concerning Best and Brightest, which the district found MCA must and should immediately reimburse $137,600 back to the state.
And thank you for bringing that forward. That was another serious issue that
extremely serious
was being discussed over many months. And the reason for that, Mr. Carter, is that based upon an Auditor General's finding that asked us to look more carefully into the charter schools, we then undertook for the 17-18 school year an auditing of the Best and Brightest program for all charter schools. Yeah. And it was Mason that we found an amount due and owing of $137,000. They initially indicated that they thought they had only owed $20,000. Itself still a significant number, but we found something very different.
And is it right, Mr. Fishbane, that MCA Board breached the terms of its own application and charter contract since the dissolution of the Financial Oversight Committee? Did that breach contract with the district in doing that?
Well, it would, because if you assume that the application is incorporated, made part of the actual charter document, then there's a presumption that the requirements in that application will be honored as part of the contractual process.
Okay. So once again, I think you did a great job in sticking to the facts and not bringing in a lot of he said, she said items. Most everything in your report, I think it was about 60 pages, was based, in my opinion, solely on factual evidence, and I appreciate you doing that. I think Mr. Whitehead's comment concerning the interview of the Parker family on NBC2, and I quote, this was on social media, in print, so therefore it was thought out, not said in passing. Is that correct? On page 35, you had said that?
Yes, that was what we find.
Okay. So, and it said, I would have no problem with facing anyone like that and terminating their lease on life. That's extremely aggressive. And with the board member seconding that, Ms. Miller said, and again, this was on social media, Joe, I agree with you, and she did go further on, which could be found on page 35. I appreciate the report, Mr. Fishbane. It is a bit disturbing, to say the least. So I don't know where we go from here. I think you turned it into the state, you had said, and
Yes.
yeah.
It's been sent to the Department of Education Charter School Division.
So what oversight do we have as a district board in these type of matters?
In these areas, I have to determine what authority we have with board members. The tension ultimately is the following. I've represented at the last board meeting, and I represent in this report, I have no interest in shutting down the school. The
I agree.
instructional model is a good one.
I agree.
And we should honor that and the teachers and the kids. So we have to think through what our next steps are going to be. That'll take a little bit of time.
I agree. I have family that just retired from the University of Michigan, both an aunt and uncle that worked in the University of Michigan on my wife's side of the family, and they say that Hillsdale College is a beacon in their community, and it is a great school. And in fact, from what I understand, it's one of the only colleges in the nation that does not take government funding. So, I mean, it's a great curriculum. I agree. I think we should do everything we can to continue moving forward with it.
They are a very fine liberal arts program, and as you'll notice in some of my recommendations, that they should be very much involved in training of the board, training in classical values for staff and so on. And so the people will not only take it cognitively, but also as part of experiential learning.
Yeah. So, okay. Thank you for your report, Mr. Fishbane. I appreciate it.
I would also like to thank you for your report, and it's very disturbing, some of the things. You went over most of them. I'm not going to go over them again, but governance is a big problem. From what I see, basically, if you stood by the letter of the law, they were acting illegally on a lot of things over the last couple of years. Lack of quorums. I had a board member that was voted in on a lack of quorum. The money owed bothers me a little bit. That could have been just an oversight, but it seems like it fits in with some of the other things that happened.
And what we found out on that actually is that they did not keep appropriate documentation,
Right.
which is a concern, and we even have indication that there were several documents that, when we were asking for them, were post-dated because they did not have the documents of the time period. And we said, no, we need to know what you had and prepared then.
One of the biggest things that bothered me was the treatment of parents, and probably the biggest, and you mentioned Ms. Lucarelli's not involvement, but her postcard or whatever it was in there, and actually had a circle around the parent they were highlighting, and then the two children.
Correct.
And that bothers me a lot. And so we need to find out, or you need to find out what needs to happen next, and I'm sure you'll take it the right way. Ms. Lucarelli?
Okay. I want to thank Mr. Fish, professional, thorough, and fact-based report on all of this, and just say how unfortunate I think it is that a school that had many parents excited for its opening and actually offers something different than what CCPS does, has leadership who clearly do not represent the values and idea that the school supposedly represents. And I think it's also unfortunate that as a school board, for all of the parents and staff that have been having all of these issues, our hands are tied. And the best that we can do is suggest to all of the parents and staff I think, is to speak to our legislators and even the governor, I guess, to encourage them to institute some either local accountability measures for charter schools or something else, so that all of these parents and families that have had so many different issues, or even board members, fellow board members that couldn't get what they needed in order to fulfill their position, so that they can be, somebody is able to help them. And I have to mention that although I strongly believe that there needs to be more accountability and transparency for charter schools, this is, at least in my tenure, the only charter school that I have received emails from and have had to hear complaints about. So we do have other charter schools in the county that don't have these issues. It's unfortunate that we have had so many. Yeah, we have 6 charter schools. And I think that in the very beginning, the leadership at Mason Classical had an opportunity to correct the issue. Unfortunately, they did not. And so here we are. And I guess at this point, I hope that the state steps in and does the right thing by way of all of the MCA teachers and parents, students and families, and finds a way to correct the situation. So thank you again for your thoroughness and professionalism. And I hope that for the families that want to stay, that are happy with the education that their children are being provided there, that that obviously we don't have any intention of closing the school, but hopefully we can make it comfortable for all families. Thanks.
Ms. Mitchell?
Yes, so I think I'll start by saying I don't think the irony is lost on anyone in this room. I know it's certainly not on me, that for all the times that Ms. Lichter, during her time on the board, called into question the integrity of people here at CCPS, the transparency of our processes, the 3 meetings that were spent fighting over meeting minutes, agenda items, that her own house was not in order. And so that is very concerning to me. And this is, as Ms. Lucarelli stated, exactly why we need better oversight of charters. Nearly $29 million of taxpayer money has gone to Mason since 2013. That in and of itself is reason enough to be concerned. And so when you have issues like this arise, there really is no recourse, not for taxpayers, not for parents and students, not for staff. The best that we can do, it sounds like, is recommend the resignation of the leadership over there, because we certainly don't want to close a school or would even recommend closing a school that's performing as highly as Mason. But ultimately, we can't enforce that resignation, most likely. So I'd like to speak to the MCA parents directly and ask you to rise up and contact your legislators, contact the Board of Education. Anyone who will listen, contact Hillsdale, fight to save your school. By all accounts, it's a highly performing academic school. You deserve better, your students deserve better, your staff deserves better. And again, this isn't a problem that we have with the other charters here in the community. I think that Ms. Lichter and others created an us versus them dynamic, which was very clever in the beginning to drum up this sense of team unity. But at the end of the day, it was based on a false premise, which was that we had it out for Mason, that we were trying to close them down. Because as Mr. Fishbane has said at previous meetings, we're saying it again tonight, that has not been even discussed. And so I would just like to implore Mason parents to fight for their children's education, fight for new leadership at MCA. However we can help you, I know that this board will support whatever we can do to that end to make it a great, great school for the kids. I attended the Ed Summit today. It was about school culture. what an impact school culture has on something as important as school safety. So that's all I would say. Thank you, Mr. Fishbane, for all of your work, very hard work, and a lot of the abuse that you've taken to this point from that group. So thank you.
Mr. Carter has a comment, then I'll get to Dr. Westbury.
Thank you, Mr. Terry. Even in Mason Academy's inception, which was, 2013, my small business supported their getting off the ground. We donated items. That's when I had my gift shop in Old Naples along with Islam. We donated items and gift certificates to help support the concept of Mason. So, and several small businesses did in this community. So not only does it hurt the dynamics of the state and the tax money, it also takes away the trust from small businesses in charter schools, and it puts a black eye when these type of things happen. So I think it's important to note that this community supports it, this board supports it, and I personally have supported it when it started off financially. So to that end, that's it.
Dr. Westbury.
Thank you, Mr. Terry. Just a quick question. Is Hillsdale College notified about this?
Yes, they are aware of it, and I've sent them, along with the state, a copy of this report because they are a central player in all of this. Mm-hmm. And so the answer to your question is yes.
I'm concerned about the lack of financial oversight. I think that's really a little scary to me because we have great financial oversight here. One of the things that I'm worried about is when this becomes a public record.
Well, in the employment context, usually give it 10 days, but I would probably see it releasable within a couple of days. Technically, we're talking about it now as a public document. So,
okay.
The approach to this is that under statute, the complaint itself function as a whistleblower complaint. And I'm not sure. I'd have to check whether the whistleblower complaint statutes follows the same timetable. I don't believe it does. The employee issue is more protectable because there's a statutory provision that if an employee is being investigated, then 10 days after the completion, it becomes open to the public. So if we followed that rule, I had sent this to you very late initially on Thursday. I know I sent a revision because of some of the typos and everything we found. Technically, it would be 10 days from the 30th if we counted a 10-day rule.
What I'm concerned about is when the names or specific names that have been in the document, and I think that people could infer who the other complainants were.
Well, there'll be some, honestly, who have children in the schools that I would feel obligated under FERPA to redact at this point to protect them. Those that indicated to me they were comfortable having their names mentioned, that's why they were. So it was not a unilateral decision just to throw their names out, knowing fully well they have children in schools and so on. It was because they felt very strongly that they had no problem disclosing it.
What I'm worried about is retaliation.
And so are they,
Okay.
frankly. So I hope it was thorough, and this was not an easy report to write.
No, and thank you very much for your concise and independent thinking.
Well,
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Fishbane. We
Yes,
really
sir.
appreciate the hard work you've put into this, and we'll see where it goes from here. Dr. Patton?
Thank you. So just a couple quick comments. One, we did have an opportunity. Mr. Coots and Dr. Carrick and I went and presented